So hello everyone and welcome back to Art of Science. My name is Graham Ambrose and I'm the host of Art of Science here. And Art of Science is a quarterly interview podcast that coincides with issues of the Policy Studies Journal. And just to kind of start off the bat, if you're listening live or recording, please rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast here. But today we have two guests. Elizabeth Koebele, who is an associate professor of in the political science department at the University of Nevada, Reno. Hello, Elizabeth. And also Deserai Crow, who's a professor at the School of Public Affairs at the University of Colorado, Denver. Hello, Deserai.
Hi, Graham.
How's it going? So both of you published a paper that came out in the May issue of PSJ entitled Mitigating Conflict with Collaboration, Researching Negotiated Agreement and Amid Belief Divergence in Environmental Governance. And kind of broadly, this paper looks at using the Advocacy Coalition framework to discuss, again, these kind of mitigation strategies for conflict. And I thought it was really interesting that you see stuff that kind of clearly aligns with these hypotheses, but you also kind of talk through these kind of breakdowns where theory kind of splits from practice. And with that, I was wondering if either of you or both of you would like to kind of dig into the paper a little bit more and kind of discuss kind of the dynamics that you're talking about.
Yeah, sure. One thing I would love to note to start off, since we're going to be digging into sort of the background of this paper, is full disclosure that Deserai was my advisor when I was in grad school at the University of Colorado Boulder, and it's been really fun to continue working with her on this and lots of other projects over time. But yeah, this was kind of a special one because it brought together some data that we've both worked on over time. So Deserai, do you want to talk about the background of the paper a little bit, and then I can dive into our theory and methods?
Yeah, absolutely. So we had this unique chance that Elizabeth's going to talk about to bring together survey and interview data from a longitudinal study of water governance in Colorado. And of course, Colorado is a state that has faced a number of water sustainability challenges. And in response to these, in 2005, Colorado's state government initiated a collaborative process to bring together diverse stakeholders across the state to develop novel and consensus-based water management solutions. And of course, we know that engaging stakeholders in a collaborative process does not necessarily mean that they're actually going to agree on things or even want to work together. And that is, in fact, what we found at times, that there were high levels of conflict that manifested among primarily two, what we call coalitions. One was primarily prioritizing water use for more traditional consumptive uses. And those are things like farming or ranching, industrial use, and municipal use. The other is more of a newcomer coalition that supports non-consumptive uses of water that leave water in the river to support environmental needs and recreation, which have, of course, become increasingly valued by Coloradans. And despite the fact that there was ongoing conflict, ultimately in 2015, a decade after this process started, we saw that the state of Colorado released its first ever statewide water plan. And that plan was based on consensus recommendations from that collaborative process. So in our study, we wanted to understand how that happened.
And it was fun because I worked on this process for both my master's and part of my dissertation, and sat through many of these early meetings and watched this conflict kind of brew between these coalitions. And it was always interesting to me to kind of step back and try to analyze what was going on empirically. And so we were interested in how the beliefs of these two coalitions potentially changed over time. And this is really because the Advocacy Coalition framework hypothesizes that large differences in beliefs or divergence in beliefs between coalitions is a major driver of conflict in the policy process. And so this sort of implicitly suggests that if we can reduce belief divergence, we may reduce conflict and foster agreement. That said, beliefs are very hard to change, and reducing belief divergence is a challenge. And we know that there's some evidence that these collaborative processes that Deserai mentioned that are focused on consensus building and dialogue and deliberation, there's some evidence that they might help stakeholders change their beliefs when they share information, they potentially learn from one another. But we don't know too much about how that mechanism actually works, if that's really the driver of negotiation in the end. So essentially, that's the question we wanted to test: if belief convergence was actually the driver of negotiated agreement here, or if agreement was reached without belief divergence or belief convergence. I'm sorry. And so to do that, we measured and assessed coalition beliefs through 3 rounds of interviews and 2 surveys of participants in this policy process. And our results show something kind of interesting, that these 2 coalitions, when we measure their beliefs kind of on our raw measures, the beliefs are actually more divergent at the end of the process when they came to that negotiated agreement than at the beginning. And that's sort of strange. That's sort of the opposite of what we expected. And when we dug into it a little bit more, what we saw was that one coalition, those traditional water users, they had pretty stable beliefs throughout this process. And that sort of makes sense because they've been participating in Colorado water politics for a really long time. Their water uses are really well rooted in law. But we have this other coalition, this newcomer coalition, and they sort of experienced this belief strengthening or reinforcement over time. They saw their beliefs as increasingly important. They saw their role in the policy process as increasingly important. And so the conclusion from this is the coalitions didn't reach negotiated agreement because their beliefs converged, but they reached negotiated agreement for some other reasons. And we were able to use our survey data and our interview data to sort of explain that as well. And just as a little preview, one of the things we found is that all stakeholders ended up recognizing that having more diverse beliefs and values in the policy process was a good thing. And even if they weren't willing to adopt the other coalition's beliefs or really change their own beliefs, they changed a little bit what they thought about the process. And we think this is important because it helps clarify some of the assumptions in the ACF, and it also helps provide us with some practical insight into how to help stakeholders work together, even amidst ongoing disagreement.
Great, that's wonderful. And I guess, so you, Elizabeth, kind of led off with this, right? So Deserai being your advisor, but even talking about a little bit, working on this as your master's project and your dissertation. I'm curious if you could talk about kind of how this specific paper came out of this bigger stream, and how did you get to kind of the end product that we see here, but the whole kind of story behind it?
Yeah, sure. I think the big picture idea for this paper was really grounded in my interest in collaborative governance. And I quickly found out that collaborative governance theory, which talks about how and why we get people with different beliefs to work together, it can clash with some of the expectations in the advocacy coalition framework. That's really grounded in this idea that beliefs are a driver of coalition bonding and working together. So to try to dig into that a little bit more, I actually started working on some of Deserai's survey data when I was in a survey methods class, because we all know, and now my students go through this, when we're in those classes, sometimes we have the opportunity to analyze our own data, and sometimes we don't have our own data. So we're looking for data sources other places. And, instead of pulling a random data set, I was fortunate enough to have Deserai say, I have the survey data that I've looked at a little bit, but there's a lot more to explore here. So I ended up kind of reanalyzing some of that survey data and started diving into these kind of coalition beliefs and what they meant. And this was from the 2009 survey. So we had kind of a survey at one point in time there. And Deserai, I didn't know if you wanted to talk about that survey a little bit more.
Sure. Yeah, I think this is a great story of just kind of creativity in thinking through research design, because we had this unique opportunity where we have these shared interests. And I originally conducted the first of the 2 surveys in 2009. And the reason I conducted that survey really stemmed from some questions that came up during my own dissertation research, where I was doing qualitative interviews with water stakeholders around the state of Colorado. And I kept hearing over and over in that qualitative data that the ways in which these stakeholders discuss water, the words they use, was varied significantly based on their longevity working in water, as well as the coalitions that they operate within. So the original survey I did in 2009 was to explore those topics that stemmed out of those interviews. And then Elizabeth had the opportunity to replicate some of the questions specifically around beliefs and coalitions, and have this cool longitudinal data set.
Yeah, I thought it was really neat too, because Deserai's original survey came right around the time where this collaborative policy process was starting, and we didn't even necessarily know, we didn't have a good idea of what solid coalitions were forming at that time. She was able to talk to a lot of people in Colorado Water who were involved in different aspects of this process. And then I ended up doing a couple more rounds of interviews in this survey in 2016, and I replicated a subset of the questions she asked in her original survey. And we asked about different types of beliefs, so specifically some substantive beliefs that stakeholders might hold, so about other water uses and what's a valid use of water, and then also about kind of the process of the roundtables. That's the collaborative process that they worked in, kind of who belongs, who speaks, who, those sorts of things, whose voice is relevant in this process, and getting some perspective into that. And so, yeah, this turned into this amazing, really cool opportunity to integrate not only interview and survey data, but to also look longitudinally and more holistically at a process. And I just feel like we don't get that opportunity when we're studying policy processes for a long time. It's really hard for any of us as academics to spend 10 years consistently studying how one policy process evolves. So we got to, use this data that was already existing and add to and expand it to produce something new.
Thanks. I appreciate the depth. And I guess I have one kind of additional question on top of this is, Elizabeth, you bring up this kind of interesting idea of this is right at kind of the time where we see these collaborative governance theories starting to come out and kind of hit a more mainstream audience. And I'm curious for both of you, both Deserai and Elizabeth, are you interested originally in the domain and kind of looked for a theory, or maybe this is different for both of you, or are you interested in kind of the theory and looked for the domain? I know some different guests that we've had have had very different thoughts about how to approach this, especially as a young scholar, right? Should you have the theory first, or should you have kind of this burning passion, if you will, first? I'm curious, kind of looking back on this project, but more broadly, what both of you think about that kind of balance.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think for me, it was actually a pretty good combination of both. I was really interested in water policy in the Western U.S. I still primarily work on now Colorado River governance, which this is a part of. And so that was definitely a substantive area that I thought was critical. But at the same time, in water management and environmental policy broadly, this trend toward collaborative policymaking was being sparked. And now it's almost ubiquitous. Now we always involve stakeholders and get, more diverse perspectives in the room and try to find consensus and reduce litigation and those sorts of things. And it now kind of feels a little old hat. But, 10 years ago, we were still seeing federal agencies figure out how to incorporate these stakeholder-driven processes into policymaking. We were still seeing theories emerge of what collaborative governance is and looks like, and what it can do and it can't do. So I think watching that theory arise, and also knowing that collaborative governance at its core, it really is about kind of doing more with less. How can we share resources? How can we work together to manage something? And I think with our our rapidly dwindling water resources in the Western US, it was kind of a prime opportunity to marry this theoretical interest I had that was sort of driven by what I was observing around me with water policy, which I was really interested in as well. And then I think the ACF fit into that nicely to give me a theoretical frame. Because of my interest in collaborative governance, I was sort of drawn to this negotiated agreement pathway of policy change in the ACF. But honestly, there's not much specification around that. And I think it's wonderful that PSJ especially has published a couple articles lately that have begun to specify more about the negotiated agreement pathway. Because before that, we kind of just heard, if coalitions are at a herding stalemate, maybe they'll learn to negotiate when they have no other options, right? But we started seeing these processes that sort of superimpose incentives to negotiate on stakeholders rather than waiting for them to be in conflict. I mean, in this case, we're also certainly in conflict, but we can start developing sort of different theory out of that. But I will say that the water policy side of this definitely drove my interest too. I mean, I always walk away saying, I was one of the few people I know that wasn't totally sick of their dissertation topic at the end and wanted to keep working on it, and I still do today. So, so I think it was a pretty good combination for me.
I remember when you came to visit campus the year you were applying to graduate school, and you talked about water management and you wanted to study this. You were coming from Arizona, and it was such a salient issue for you and where you've lived. So I think that's it's no surprise you're still doing this work. For me, I think a lot of it, probably all of my research interests have stemmed from a combination of personal experiences or observations. So, for example, I grew up in Colorado. Most of my research is in the Western US. And starting in water, if you grow up in the Western US, water is always a conversation, increasingly so. And so just seeing how resource limited we are and trying to understand how we make better, more sustainable decisions is kind of what started my research path. But over time, most of my research now is either still in environmental management, but also in hazards and disasters and crisis. And a lot of that has actually come from the communities that I live in and around and care about, having been affected by floods and wildfires and other disasters. And so for me, as an academic, I want to be able to say, do something. And I'm not a first responder. And so understanding the processes that can help communities become more resilient to various hazards and disasters, that's kind of where I view the space that that feels good and feels productive and useful. But also in terms of the theoretical background, I would say simultaneously, the things that have always interested me are kind of political strategies and communication, and that comes in part from just my own. I'm a political animal, and also I have a background in media, and so naturally I've gravitated towards the two theories that I use the most are the narrative policy framework and the advocacy coalition framework, because of the focus on coalition strategies and resources. So I think that just kind of stems from my own interest in those things in the world, those variables in the world that I have seen as important or interesting myself. So that's where mine comes from.
Great. And I appreciate the specific stories, but I guess one kind of further push for both of you, just advice for kind of younger scholars. How should they be looking at kind of all these frameworks that are out there, and maybe all the kind of attention grabbing crises or kind of domains that require our attention? Do you have any advice of kind of how to hone in on a specific theory or domain, and both get the dissertation done, but kind of keep that whole research process flowing. And Elizabeth, like you're saying, you weren't sick of it. You kept on going, right? So I'm curious if you have any advice kind of more broadly about both narrowing the scope, but also kind of staying interested and continuing to work on that same topic.
Yeah, I think finding something you're interested in the first place, something you're really genuinely interested in, is so important. And I know that is a challenge for a lot of grad students. You know, you can be kind of pushed into studying one topic based on your funding or who's, available to advise you. I got so lucky there. I think that if you can find something that you're really passionate and excited about, it's going to keep motivating you. I can't tell you how many hours I spent sitting in meetings of this collaborative process and driving around the state to go, 8 hours to Durango to go to one of these meetings. And I was honestly really excited and motivated the whole time. And being there and interacting with those folks was a huge motivator too. I think as far as theory, like, I'm a total theory nerd, and I think a lot of people know that, but I get almost just as excited about trying to figure out why a process works the way it does. And one of the things that I think is really powerful about policy process theories is they give us suggestions for how something might work, and then we get to spend some time kind of exploring and testing them. And admittedly, I was a little bit afraid when I started writing my dissertation as, a total junior scholar in the field to push back against some of the assumptions in the ACF. But I would say that the ACF community has been so welcoming with that too. And I think that's a huge recommendation I'd give to folks, like, get to know the other people who are working on whatever theory seems to fit with your question. Talk to them. I mean, I've worked across a lot of policy theory now, and the communities are really, really generous, especially to young scholars. And so, yeah, that would be another kind of broad piece of advice. Like, if you have a theory where you have an interesting kind of theoretical question and you can reach out to other folks, then you're likely to be able to push really good research forward that's sort of sustainable. And I think that also goes for data too. I mean, I was lucky because Deserai and I did have this common interest, and there was data there, and we were already working together, and we could have those hard conversations about data or replicating data collection methods and making sure they're reliable and those sorts of things. But it's kind of inspired me, like, in the future to reach out to other folks, maybe even if I don't know them that well, but if I read a paper that I think is really neat or inspiring, and I think I can build on that, to actually not just do that in my own little silo, but to be part of this community that I'm working with, and use that as a jumping off point to do better, more innovative scholarship than I could do alone.
Yeah, I would totally echo what Elizabeth said. I think that I think policy process scholars of any kind of subfield are some of the most generous and kind of they're focused on building community, supporting junior scholars. And so I absolutely encourage students and other junior scholars to reach out to people whose work interests them. But I also agree with what Elizabeth said. You have to find something that you care enough about to research that you're not going to get bored. Even if you're ready to be done with that particular topic in your dissertation, that there's something in the broader field of, in our case, environmental policy, that won't make you totally crazy to do. And over time, you can broaden out. And like I said, a lot of my research, the way I describe it is, it's evolved from just being environmental policy, and I focus on risks and managing those risks that communities face. And that includes environmental, but also includes public health. And both Elizabeth and I have worked on an amazing team where we looked at state and individual level risk mitigation decisions and policy change within and after COVID. And so, those interests can change and evolve, but as long as you have kind of a bucket of things that you are interested enough in personally that will keep you motivated for a number of years, I think that's really what you need to do. But yeah, in terms of the theories, in terms of the scholarship, I think our community is very welcoming and very supportive of one another. We are not one of those subdisciplines or disciplines that has a bad reputation for being nasty at conferences or being awful reviewers. We try to be, I think, constructive and productive.
Wonderful. Elizabeth, just to kind of hop into a question or a comment that you brought up is kind of reaching out and asking kind of questions to re-engage in data and these kind of re-engage in the topic. I am curious how both of you kind of decided that you could replicate this study, that you decided then to also match it with the interviews itself. Because again, doing the longitudinal stuff, but I think also matching different types of data is something that we might not see as much as maybe we should or we could in the future. So I'm curious just to kind of get under the hood if you guys can talk about, again, deciding to come back to the data, but then also pairing it with kind of a different form of data in this paper.
Yeah, I think it's always a challenge to figure out how to integrate different forms of data. And as much as we like to say that, mixed method studies can give us better insight into questions, actually doing that practically is really challenging. And it's something I still get pushback from reviewers on all the time and I'm constantly navigating. So I don't think there's one right way to do it by any means. I think I kind of thought about the qualitative data in two ways. I did a set of interviews in about 2013, 2014 for my master's thesis, and I ended up using that as a way to shape my survey, meaning I understood the stakeholders' language, I understood their concerns. I even ended up bringing my survey to the government agency that was administering this process, and they had me add in a couple questions that helped them too, which is always nice, and they gave me some feedback, and we did some piloting. So then when I did my survey, it really was well aligned with kind of what the interviews were telling me. And then I did my other set of interviews afterward. And that actually was more of kind of a data interpretation exercise. When I saw some trends in my survey data, I went back and said, I didn't go back to all of the stakeholders. I went back to kind of a subset of like leaders in the process and asked for kind of overarching insights onto why some of these trends might be occurring. So those are two ways that I've been able to integrate survey data and interview data. But I also want to note that I feel like we just got lucky with the way these interviews and surveys were sort of spread out over time. We had such kind of a nice spread that covered a lot of gaps and a lot of important moments in this process. And a little bit of that is luck too, for sure.
I think a little bit of all research projects, or at least successful research, is luck. Absolutely. I would say that I think both Elizabeth and I come from a tradition where mixed methods is really embraced, and critical thinking about interviews. I teach qualitative research methods, and I'm a big believer in qualitative data allowing us to understand more nuance and context than we can through survey data, but survey data being able to help us understand broader trends in a population. And so I think both of us naturally have, in many of our projects over the years, used multiple sources of data like this. So it has, at first it's tricky because there are models to, what you do with, you have a survey paper, and what you do if you have a qualitative case study paper. So figuring out your own process for integrating both of those sources of data can be a little tricky at first. But I think once you get used to it, it becomes very second nature to want both of those types of data so that you can understand kind of both depth and breadth of an issue.
So I guess the question that comes to mind is, was gathering both kind of systematic, or once you got the second, Elizabeth, kind of what you alluded to, you got the second round of survey data, and you're like, I need to figure this out. So you went back and got the additional interviews. And I'm curious, so kind of reactionary, really strategic, and how do you both kind of play off this idea when doing mixed methods research? How much of it is planned out, and how much is like, we need to go and find this last piece?
Yeah. I think in this project, it was a little bit of both, because I had seen Deserai's survey and had played with the data a little bit and was interested in replicating questions. And so I think that part was very strategic, but it was honestly just one part of a broader survey. And I've published other papers that have stemmed from other parts of that survey on things like policy learning, for instance. And so I think, in some ways you're always kind of figuring, I don't want to say figuring it out as you go along, but you need to be adaptive, I think, is the way to go. Like, we were strategic with questions, but we also needed to be adaptive. And yeah, going back to stakeholders and doing a second set of interviews and asking them to describe trends, that can be one way to do some adaptation. Another thing that we had to adapt specifically in this paper was we asked about demographics in slightly different ways. So even though we mirrored our questions, Deserai had asked some questions about what organizations people belong to. By the time I got to surveying, it made more sense to ask them about what other stakeholders they worked with in the process. So we kind of got at similar things, but asking different questions, and that took some careful data imputation, some hard discussions too. Like, we really had to go back and look carefully at the data to make sure we were being as consistent as possible. And I think that's a challenge with any longitudinal study, right? If you try to do a survey 7 years apart, some things are naturally going to change in the context, and you need to be adaptive. But yeah, kind of a combination of that strategic and sort of adaptive as you go, I think was what drove this paper.
And I think you get that even with, like a very well planned out project that is funded by NSF or something like that both Elizabeth and I have had, where you have your plan and you have your Gantt chart of which, quarter you're going to do which survey or data collection method. But then an event can happen. I'm with our COVID project right after our first, or right around the time of our first survey, was it, Elizabeth, that that George Floyd was murdered. And so that was something that not only was so salient in American politics and policy and at the time, but also could have affected whether people were social distancing, whether they went out to protests, whether they did things like that. And so we had to kind of think through some of those things as well as we were doing those surveys. And so I would just say, even the best laid plans, and you have everything charted out, which in this case, as Elizabeth said, we got as lucky as anything. But even when you have those plans charted out, I think it's really important to be adaptable so that you can pick up on some event or some new information that you might not have otherwise.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And it just makes me think of kind of the importance of this research in general, right? It's not in a petri dish, which in some ways makes it a lot harder because you have to control for all these things. But I would like to believe that it's also what makes it as important as it is, right? Kind of critically thinking about the broader system and how this all plays back in is challenging but important. So yeah, very, very interesting and very cool. I guess kind of zooming out here and kind of thinking more broadly, is there any kind of advice that you'd have for younger scholars? Might that be kind of more junior scholars or PhD students?
I think from this paper, one thing I took away was you can't imagine every analysis you're going to do before you collect the data. And I always tell my students now that surveys are kind of like a high risk, high reward type of data collection method. You only really have the chance to do it once. So think about your analysis as much as you can before you do that. But you can. I mean, we've been talking a lot about being adaptable. And so I think, figuring out how to dive in and try to answer a question the best you can, but also kind of take that broader view. Be open to using like adjacent sources of data. We've done some scraping of documents and recoding of other, textual sources to try to get kind of formal language that's been written over time to give us a sense of what's going on. And of course, that can't always substitute for what you'd want to look at through primary data. But being kind of adaptable and bringing in those other sources, I would say, is an important thing we learned from this paper and carried forth into other projects. And so I don't know. I guess the takeaway message is like, you can plan for the best, but it's probably not going to all work out. And if you kind of roll the punches and keep looking into this topic, especially if it's something you're interested in, which we also talked about, there's a story there, and it sometimes takes a little while to find it. But yeah, using different sources of data, trying to be creative, and being able to pull something together from that, I think is the advice I'd give students. I know certainly in the middle of my dissertation, I was just reflecting on this with one of my students, and I'm sure Deserai remembers this moment, but I think I was halfway through and I was like, I don't even know what I'm writing about. This doesn't make sense. Like, what am I doing? But yeah, kind of taking a step back, looking at the bigger picture, all of those sorts of things, I think can be really, really helpful to remember. It can be hard when you zoom into a lot of deep methodology and a lot of deep data analysis, and you sort of lose the forest for the trees sometimes. So yeah, being adaptable, looking at the bigger picture, I think those are kind of the two main takeaways for me.
Yeah, I would build on that. I totally agree with what Elizabeth said. And I would say also surrounding yourself with and finding good people to work with. In our dissertations, we all, do independent work, and that's an important part of becoming a scholar. But I think I've been fortunate enough. My first collaborator, Betsy Albright at Duke, was one of my friends from grad school, and we both did our PhD at Duke together. And now I'm working with Betsy and another one of our friends from grad school, Katie Dickinson, on a couple of projects. And then, I've had so many. So I would say just probably more than anything else, I've learned over the years that surrounding yourself with good humans and people who care about you and who you care about and who are smart and fun and, motivated to keep a project going, like that's in the end critical. And I think no point was that more obvious. I think Elizabeth and I, on one of our projects, after her first year in grad school, I met her to do some interviews downtown in Denver. We're doing some interviews on renewable portfolio standards, and I had been on maternity leave. And sometimes your life can't be just compartmentalized. And I think that COVID taught us that as well. And in our COVID research group, we often talk about how it was as much a support group as it was a research collaborative. And we got to know each other very well and see our kids in the background and animals crawling across screens and all of that. And I think that really human connection, I think it's good for creativity. I think it's great for collaboration and for fostering the trust that you need to be able to ask tough questions sometimes, or to be able to give someone criticism on something as personal as their writing or whatever it might be. And so I think that to me, it all comes down to working with good people. And I've been very fortunate in that regard to work with good friends. Elizabeth is a great example of students becoming good friends and collaborators over time. That's hands down my biggest recommendation.
Yeah, I think I carry that message forward to my students now. Like I always tell them that your dissertation committee is kind of like your community, and when it doesn't make sense, you have lots of voices to bounce things off of, and it's even better when you are able to have those moments where you get to establish kind of a personal relationship, and it makes the research process a lot more fulfilling in my mind too. I always say I never want to write a paper by myself again. I feel like I think better. I produce more interesting insight when I'm around a bunch of other smart people who can help me process things. And so, yeah, definitely agree with that part of it.
So to just follow up on this, right? I think this advice is commonly given to kind of find the right people, to kind of build these collaborations. And I guess, do you have any advice on kind of ways to foster that, or what to look for, and kind of actually building that community as a young scholar as well?
Yeah, go for it.
That's a really good question. I think that I think your gut can tell you a lot when you meet someone. Like, there are a lot of brilliant people, creative people in the policy field. And I know a lot of terrific people, but also you're trusting someone a lot to do a collaborative project together. And even the most brilliant, cool, amazing person that I call a friend may or may not be someone who is a good fit in terms of that collaboration. And so finding that, I think, to the title of your podcast, is as much of an art as it is a science. I think that trusting those instincts of, is this someone who, if the wheels fell off and I got COVID and I needed a month extension on something, would beat me up for it, or would say, yeah, you do you take care of yourself, I'm thinking about you, and send you a lasagna or what, like. And so just really feeling that kind of human level gut instinct. And that sounds very, very hand wavy and vague for an empiricist to say, but I think it's important because and also not being afraid to reach out to people. Like, I did this at Midwest Political Science Conference, I don't know, 10 years ago. And I kind of cold emailed Tom Birkland, and being in disaster research, I was like, I need to meet Tom. And I was like, do you have time for coffee? And of course he was generous. And of course, being Tom, we had a 2-hour lunch and not a 10-minute coffee. And from that grew a great friendship. And so I think that being able to reach out to those people and talk to people, and I don't know, what else do you think, Elizabeth?
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned Tom, because I was thinking too, like I talked to Tom at another MPSA meeting once and asked him a question about his textbook that I was teaching in my undergrad policy class. And he was like, oh, you actually read it close enough to ask me this question about it? Can you review this other chapter? And instantly it was like, welcome to the community. And I mean, yeah. I think maybe we're lucky because the barriers are a little lower in the policy process community. Like we said, people are really generous with their time, really supportive. It is easy to cold call, someone and say, hey, I read this before. Can you talk to me a little bit more about it? Or, would you like to maybe think about if we can build on this in some way? So I think that's really important. I'd also say, I think Deserai really instilled this in me too when I was a grad student, but just showing up is really important. This was sort of before the days of Zoom, when I was doing my first round of interviews, and it would have been much easier for me to pick up the phone and call people, but instead I found myself driving to Craig, Colorado in the middle of a week, across the state, to go sit around a table with a bunch of people in hunters camo and talk about water policy, and showing up for when you're doing your research, and then showing up in the same way for when you're around your colleagues, making time to go to dinner, making time to go to conferences and network and all of that. I mean, again, yeah, it sounds yeah, sort of hand wavy maybe is the term Deserai used, but I think that that's been really important. It's an important part of professionalization and finding those people you trust in the discipline. And it's hard, right? We all have like a million things to do. Sometimes when I'm at a conference, I'm like trying to finish a paper, or I just want to sleep in my hotel room. But, you know, showing up, being kind of present, being part of the discipline is really important, and I think we're lucky to be in a discipline that welcomes you into that.
Yeah, every year at Midwest, Mike Jones and Melissa Mary and I reminisce over the year that we're all somewhere finishing up our PhDs, and we got stuck on an 8 a.m. Sunday morning panel together, and the three of us and our co-authors were the only people in the audience because it was Sunday at 8 a.m. And yet we chatted, we realized we had these shared interests, and we've become friends and collaborators since. And so be open to those opportunities, even if you get stuck on a Sunday morning 8 a.m. panel.
So as we kind of wrap up the hour here, just the broad question of kind of looking back to when you were a PhD student or a junior faculty, do you have any advice for yourself that you think would be kind of valuable to share?
Go first.
Sure. So I remember the first rejection I received from a journal, and I was absolutely devastated. And this was back in snail mail. And one of my dissertation committee members, good friend, told me to just like put the letter on my desk and wait until I was ready. I have no patience. So of course I did not abide by that advice. But I think if I could remind my more junior self that even some people phrase it unnecessarily harsh, which I don't think is good for academic culture, but nonetheless, criticism will make you better. And every time you're forced to articulate the why of your research, or to hone your writing, or define your concepts more clearly, you're becoming a better scholar. And so even if you have to respond to nasty reviewer number 2, which of course PSJ never has, because PSJ's reviewers are wonderful. But even when you have to respond to that challenging reviewer, it is forcing you to become a more deliberate and successful scholar, even though it can be tough. And I definitely lived that. But yeah, so responding to criticism, or at least accepting it with a little more grace than I probably did at first, is what I would say.
Yeah, I think I would say to follow your gut on some of these things. One of the other policy processes that I studied as part of this was something that was kind of emerging at the time. It was really messy. It wasn't a very clean process to study. It was hard to get information about. But for some reason, it felt like it was important. I knew the context well enough. It was something that just started. And even my committee was like, do you really, like, why'd you pick this one? You know, and it has since sort of re-showed up a number of times in the world and in the policymaking sphere. And I'm glad I followed my gut on that one. But it's hard, right? You want to have kind of what's wrapped up in a perfect box with a perfect bow, and be able to say, like, this is a nice clean project. And it's not always that way. It's messy, and sometimes you have to really dig through and you know, go through many, many iterations of things, right? I think that's another thing. Deserai mentioned our reviewers already, and I would just say, you know, our reviewers and the editorial board at PSJ also really helped us with this paper. We definitely went through a number of rounds of revision and iterations. The editors gave us a really nice, clear summary of some guidance to follow, and that's all really important. And trusting your gut through that. If you have something interesting, it may not be a super clear pathway or a super clean pathway, but following your instinct there, I think, can be really helpful. And then, using your community around you as kind of a sounding board to figure out, okay, even if this is messy, maybe what's a path I can try. I think one other kind of example I'll add on to that, because we were talking about mixed methods before, is I think trusting yourself to choose your methods and your design wisely, maybe even if it isn't like the most hip or whatever thing in the discipline at the time. I think we find a number of us that do kind of like deeply qualitative work sometimes find ourselves getting pushback. Why aren't you quantifying these trends? Why aren't you? And it can sometimes be hard. I remember as a grad student, like getting that feedback from a senior scholar at a conference and being like, oh, maybe I should just do regressions all day long, But I'm glad I sort of trusted my gut and figured out, I want to do this research right for the types of questions I'm trying to answer. And if I'm interested in the why and the mechanism behind things, like I have to use an approach that makes sense. So, so I'd encourage, junior scholars to trust themselves a little bit more. And that criticism that you get can be hard, but you probably also know that you're, what you're doing a little bit more than you think you do.
Great. Well, thank you both, Elizabeth and Deserai, for joining us for the last hour or so. I really appreciate it. I know both of you are busy, so taking the time out has been wonderful. And just want to say thanks again.
Yeah, thank you, Graham. This is fun.
Thanks for having us.
Of course, of course. So with that, I just want to kind of remind everybody that's listening to rate, review, and subscribe. Also, thank you to PSJ, the Policy Studies Journal, as well as the Center for Policy Design and Governance here at Syracuse University. Through both of these organizations and their joint initiative, we're able to put together this podcast. So thank you to both of them. And finally, again, thanks to our guests, and see everybody next quarter.